Now, ordinarily, if we were together in person, and I do want to kind of stop, I will allow for some time with this. I would have you talk about who are your underserved at your tables, right? Remember those days when we're in a big room all together with tables, right? Let me give you my definition of underserved. It is an underserved student is any student who's not successful academically, socially, or behaviorally in school. Here's the key part: because the school as an institution is not being responsive to the student. And I want you to think of your disproportionality. I want you to think of something that is historic in your district. I want you to think of it as institutional. Who are the students that are underserved, right? And I want you to identify them and then sort of have a conversation with yourself, or if you're with other people, just say, okay, I want to make sure that you don't talk in code. So I want you to kind of say, who are the underserved? But then I want you to think about how are you currently serving them or not serving them, right? And what has been your successes and failures? Um, where is culturally responsive teaching currently going on? And have you differentiated the conversation about race, culture, and language? Have you talked about it in the context of equity? If you, as you go through these questions, what I want you to really determine is, are we really talking about these students in authentic ways, or are we talking in code? That's really what you're trying to determine with this conversation. And our format doesn't allow for us to speak. To have this type of discussion, but this is a very important discussion. And I would say, as if you're attending this as summit virtually, but with other people, that when you come together to kind of debrief, that you have this conversation. Who are your underserved, right? Who are your underserved? Who are the students that are getting bad customer service? Make sure you're not talking in code. So let me see. That's the activity we usually do, a table talk, right? We already know that in our society we talk in code, right? What's code? Generalizations. Here are the top 5 underserved populations. This has not changed. I've had this slide for too long, and we know when it comes to high school graduation rates, when it comes to reading levels, when it comes to dropouts, um, all the matrix, all the metrics that we use, typically it falls into these top 5 categories, right? Now here's the problem. These are generalizations. These are talking about the big groups, and by talking about the big groups tells us nothing about what's going on underneath. So I want you to use that frame. Talking about the big groups does not tell us anything about what's happening underneath. So if I say to you, where Native Americans are our most underserved population when it comes to just throwing any metrics, what can you do with that information? What can you go? You go like, okay, okay, thanks for telling me. Or you begin to make assumptions, you begin to draw conclusions, right? And so my point is that we can't go anywhere with we can't go anywhere with generalizations. We have to be in a position, we have to be in a position to we have to be in a position to talk about the specifics. Okay? So one thing that I definitely want you to take away from this keynote is this: stop talking in generalizations. Let's stop talking about it in terms of African American students. Let's just stop talking about it in terms of Latino, Latina, or Hispanic students, whatever terminology you use. Let's dig under. So, for example, go to, if you see my third thing there, right? It says Mexican immigrants or Americans, right? And what it's saying is, when you look at the Latina population, who's most likely to be underserved? It's our Mexican immigrants or our Mexican American students. That's digging under there, right? And so we know that history teaches us who's most likely to be underserved. And these are communities, these are marginalized populations that their American dream opportunities were denied or stilted over time. We know that there was some attempt to deny the use or or functionality of their indigenous culture and language within the framework of the school. We know that in general, the American education system has failed, right? And we know that they have developed their own sort of community languages, if you will, or a way to keep their languages thriving despite being denied in the institution. So history kind of gives us a sense of who these communities, these cultures are, but we still have to dig underneath that, right? We can actually divide the group into two. There's another activity I have in here that we can divide our all of us into either a cult where we are people or population of assimilation, a people or population of deculturalization, or bicultural. Joel Spring does an excellent job of this. If you ever have a chance to read this book called Deculturalization: A Struggle of Equality, and he goes through and talks about the populations that basically have had success in the United States due to assimilation or what he calls cultural absorption versus the ones that were deculturalized, meaning they went to school and their culture and their language was taken from them or they were made to feel bad about it. And we're trying to avoid this dynamic through the process of cultural linguistic responsive. Point is, we don't want any populations deculturalized, right? So we have to dig under the generalization. So instead of using the term indigenous or native, right, you have to know who are your native indigenous students that you're working with. Specifically, there are nearly 300 nations throughout the United States, and each one has a particular cultural difference. Yes, there are some similarities, but there are a lot of differences that you must recognize in order to be culturally and linguistically responsive. So the question I ask you is, do you know your Native American students? I'm not saying know them as Native Americans, but know them as Pueblo, know them as Lakota, know them as Navajo. That's what I'm asking you. And if you don't, you need to, because that's the only way that you're going to be culturally and linguistically responsive. When it comes to our Latino, Latina students, do you know who they are, right? Or are you just continuing to use an overall label of Hispanic or Latino or Latina, Latinx, whatever? It doesn't matter. It's still a generalization, right? Each of these provide a different cultural dynamic. Guatemala versus Belize, or Mexico versus Peru, or versus Honduras, right? There are differences, and we have to recognize those differences with our students in order to be culturally responsive. So let me ask you, do you know who your Latino, Latina students are? Or are you just calling them one big general name, general category? We know very concretely from research that Mexicans are the most likely to be underserved in our schools. Um, um, and that doesn't matter if they're Mexican American, second, third, fourth generation, or recent immigrants. They tend to be the most underserved. So we have some indicators of how we can dig under that. When it comes to your African students, have you lumped them all together like our research does? Or do you separate them out about by students who are coming from, African countries, students who are coming from Caribbean countries, or the students who are quote unquote US Black, right? Because they are all different culturally, and we can't lump them all together. We have to separate them out. So let me ask you, who are your African students, right? And I'm saying who are your African in terms of American students, which I would call US Black. Who are your African students coming out of West African or African countries? And then we're going to throw in the Caribbean countries as well. Have you separated them because they are all different culturally? If you've not, and you're just calling them African or African American, which would be even worse, right? Then you're not being culturally responsive. So I'm hoping you're getting my point. What about your Asian students? This is one of the most generalized groups of all time, right? We rarely ever break down our Asian students. So who are your Asian students? Chinese, Samoan, Hmong, Filipino, or have you just lumped them all together, right? And if you've done that, then that's not being culturally responsive. You need to dig under because each of these represents a different culture, all right? I hope you got my point. Now, once we come out of generalizations, then the